Uh, Welcome, everybody, to CSAC. We're really looking forward to a great conversation today with Professor Jeff Ding. For those of you who don't know Jeff, Jeffrey Ding is an assistant professor of political science at George Washington University. He primarily researches U.S.-China competition and cooperation, focused on emerging technologies. His book, which if you haven't picked it up, you should buy it. It's a good one. Technology and the Rise of Great Powers, How Diffusion Shapes Economic Competition, was published this year by Princeton University Press. And previously, Jeff was a postdoctoral fellow, most importantly, here at CSAC. So it's wonderful to welcome him back. It really is a terrific book. It challenges a bunch of conventional wisdoms about the ways in which technological revolutions shape the rise of great powers. And I was particularly struck, I think it's really kind of actually a poster child for how to write a rigorous and deeply historically minded book that nevertheless has profound implications for the contemporary policy conversations around emerging technologies, especially artificial intelligence. So we're really grateful to have Jeff back. And we'll do the standard thing where Jeff will talk for about half an hour or so, and then we will open it up to questions. We will start with the fellows here in the room, and then we will broaden out the conversation to include others in the room and those online. If you're watching online, you can put a question in the Q&A box, and I will be monitoring in real time. So Jeff, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Colin, for that generous introduction, and especially means a lot coming from you, because I know you're thinking a lot about these issues and you've been plugged into the policymaking landscape on these topics as well. It's really good to be back here. I will try not to be daydreaming about the Olympic-sized outdoor pool that's just maybe 5 minutes away, where I spent a lot of time during my time as a postdoc here. I want to start, and I'm going to be quick. I'm going to try to finish before 30 minutes so we can have more room for discussion and questions. But let me start with this picture of U.S.-China competition in artificial intelligence and what people refer to as an AI arms race. And I will start with this picture, one, because I think during the pandemic, I really got obsessed with chess again because of the Queen's Gambit. And so I want to choose a chess illustration, but two, because I think it illustrates it illustrates one of the key things about our conception of the competition between the US and China, which is it's very confused and muddied, and this type of chessboard setup would never even exist, right? The kings aren't supposed to touch each other. I think one way we can ground our discussion about technology and the rise and fall of great powers is this quote by Chinese leader Xi Jinping given at the BRICS summit, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, in July 2018, where he talks about how new advances in AI are going to change the trajectory of human history. And he specifically calls back to 3 past industrial revolutions: mechanization in the first, electrification in the second, informatization in the third. So in the Chinese system, what often happens is after leadership gives a speech, there's some time, and then commentators and analysts try to parse through that speech and decipher it. So here's a publication from a Chinese Communist Party publication called Study Times that goes back to that speech and analyzes it, and specifically places emphasis on which country was able to take advantage of these past industrial revolutions to achieve a productivity advantage, or to become the world's most advanced productivity leader. So keep that in mind now as we transition to looking at what does the existing international relations literature think about this landscape of technology and the rise and fall of great powers. Here's Paul Kennedy's seminal work, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, that points out this process, this pattern by which the rise and fall of great powers involves technological changes that then lead to shifts in the differentials in economic growth rates, right? So a shift in the global economic balance of power. And then that gradually shapes geopolitical and military influence. So today, and what the book focuses on is just that first step in that causal chain. technological change and shifts in the global economic balances. Specifically, which power can sustain economic growth in the long run, right, which comes from productivity advances over their great power rivals. Conventional wisdom is based on this leading sector theory, where one country dominates all the key innovations in a fast-growing industry. That industry is incubated by a new technology, and then that country takes advantage of monopoly profits to become the world's most productive economy. There's a lot of names here that should be familiar: the Gilpins of the world, the Kennedys of the world, Modelsky and Thompson. Dan Dresner sums that up by saying, a great power has acquired hegemon status historically through a near monopoly on innovation in leading sectors. And I think it's a very influential perspective in policymaking circles as well. To flesh out that leading sector account more, they're building off of this classic sequence of great leading sectors that development economist Walt Rostel outlines. So think of industries like cotton textiles, steel, chemicals that sprout up off the back of new innovations, oftentimes become the largest industry in a country. They're very fast growing, and political scientists have largely just adopted this scheme. What the book argues is there's an alternative explanation, and it's based first on a different trajectory of how technology impacts economic power transitions. The starting point is a general purpose technology, which are these foundational transformations like electricity, the steam engine, the computer, that affect economic productivity in a pathway that differs from the leading sector account I just told you. And once we have a different technological pathway, that's going to shape the type of institutional adaptations that are the most important. So for my work, I focus on skill formation institutions. And the ones that are most suitable to adapting to GPTs are education and training systems that widen the base of engineering skills associated with these technologies. So I gave you the snippet. We're going to dive deeper into the argument and the theory, and then I'm going to present one of the cases, one of the three historical cases, and then we'll conclude with implications for US-China competition in artificial intelligence. The framework for the argument is that technologies present these new challenges, right? The particular features of technologies, not all technologies are created equal. The particular features create this missing puzzle piece, and countries have to fit their institutions to adapt to those demands. The issue is that the conventional wisdom leading sector account is overly focused on that most dramatic aspect of technological change, that development that gets featured on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg, the eureka moment of initial innovation. And so then it's all about, can a rising power develop the institutions to corner profits, to monopolize profits and exports in these fast-growing industries? I think one way to think about the existing account is this idea of a product cycle, basically treating the country as a firm that comes up with like a new smartphone product innovation. And there's that brief window of time where your R&D lets you have that window of monopoly profits, but then eventually competitors come up, they mass produce the phone, they develop alternatives, and you lose that unique monopoly on product innovation. Okay, so here's just some quotes from these scholars that show, okay, these innovations cluster in this one country. Greatest marginal stimulation to growth comes early on in a leading sector's development, right? That brief window. You're the pioneer until the diffusion process happens, right? So for leading sectors, it's that cutting edge R&D, new to the world innovation, and then once it becomes diffused on a widespread level, their story stops. For me, that's where my story begins, with general purpose technologies. And GPTs, according to economists and economic historians, are engines of productivity growth. They often precede huge waves of productivity growth. Those are some of the characteristics that define GPTs in the literature. What I want to emphasize here, though, is this quote from, I think, Stanford economist Paul David, where he identifies this regular pattern by which GPTs make their mark. It's an extended trajectory of gradual and protracted diffusion into widespread use. And you need all these other complementary innovations and adaptations. You need talent to catch up in all these other streams, in all these other application sectors. So we've covered why GPTs. Second part of GPT diffusion theory is why diffusion. And I think my argument here is not that being the first to introduce new technologies doesn't matter. It's just, obviously, there's probably some advantage. It's probably correlated with being the first to then adopt technologies at scale. But the key point here is it's not determinative. There's all these other factors that shape whether countries are able to adopt a GPT at scale. For me, I highlight the skill formation institutions. And oftentimes, there's a lot of evidence that, for example, latecomers can have an advantage. And there's a big divergence between the country that's the innovation leader and the country that's the diffusion leader. And when I say diffusion leader, I mean diffusion throughout the entire economy, sort of an internal diffusion process. And there's a lot of literature that says if you narrow your lens to only focusing on advanced economies at the technological frontier, they're like, for example, in the AI space, China has really strong frontier firms and frontier universities in AI as well. Innovation leadership is going to be contested. So there's this counterintuitive point that actually among the advanced economies, imitation is going to matter more, when we usually think of imitation as something for less developed countries to focus on. So I've set out a different trajectory of GPTs. Now the argument says which institutions best adapt to the demands of general purpose technologies. And for that, I focus on training and education institutions that widen the pool of engineering talent. Why engineering talent specifically? The first reason is obvious. You just need to skills have to catch up to adapt to new technologies, especially ones that are so pervasive as GPTs. But I think the second one is really important in that for a GPT to make its mark, it has to spread throughout all these different application sectors, all with their unique demands. And so there has to be a fair amount of information flow between the GPT sector and all these application sectors, right? If the construction industry is trying to apply AI in this way, whereas the tutoring industry is trying to apply AI in this other way, and they don't have a good agreement on what the standard in the field is and where technology is going, you're not going to get the complementary, that complementarity that I've been talking about. And so engineering talent solves a lot of that, right? When there's a discipline and there's a standardized and systemized set of knowledge. And that's why historically, when you have a new GPT, oftentimes an engineering discipline follows pretty quickly in the wake. Electricity and electrical engineering, mechanization, mechanical engineering. The computer science is very much an engineering-oriented discipline. So just to sum up the theory here in a table, we have two different mechanisms, leading sector product cycles and GPT diffusion. Sorry, the bottom is cut off a little bit. They differ on three technological dimensions that make up the technological trajectory, and then that shapes the differences when it comes to institutional adaptations. So I've gone through some of these, right? Leading sector product cycles, the impact of the technology comes in the early stages. For GPTs, it's disproportionate in the later stages. The technological phase of change that's most important for leading sector product cycles is a monopoly on innovation. For GPTs, it's about an edge in diffusion. The breadth of growth, the breadth of technological change for leading sector product cycles, it's concentrated in those one or two industries. For GPTs, they need all these other industries to also come up with complementary innovation, so it's more dispersed and more broad-based. And that shapes the institutional adaptations, right? If you're in this leading sector product cycle mode, you might only care about protecting against technological leakage, or you might only care about training the best and the brightest. It's a different story for sort of this GPT skill infrastructure that I'm talking about. Okay, let me go through the empirical evidence with the focus on the second industrial revolution. So what I'm doing here in this case is basically taking that previous table and tracing all those different expectations to see what the evidence from the second industrial revolution favors. Is it the GPT diffusion mechanism or the leading sector product cycle mechanism? Just to set the scene, 1870 to 1914, you have both the cause and the outcome present, right? You have a technological revolution that some people deem the second industrial revolution with all these different innovations. And then you have a shift in the balance of economic power, what David Landy's historian calls a shift from a unipolar system, one nation, to a multi-nation industrial system. Key reference point for present-day discussions, every time you hear the phrase AI is the new electricity, they're calling back to this period. What I'm saying is let's take that comparison seriously and try to figure out what we can learn from this case. So one last really important point of background, the US, not Germany, becomes the clear economic leader in this period, 1870 to before 1914. And so the source is cut off here, but it's the Madison Project database, and it looks at it's a database that collects information on long-term economic trends. And on all these different measures of economic efficiency, it's the US with the blue that becomes the economic leader. Germany in the red never surpasses the UK when it comes to these different economic productivity statistics. So let's go through all those different dimensions briefly when it comes to the second industrial revolution. So first we start with impact time frame. Was it gradual and protracted, or did the impact of these technologies, were they lopsided in the early stages? And I think there's really strong evidence for gradual and protracted timelines. So Germany does capture a huge share of world dyestuff production in this new chemical industry. But if you're looking at it from how did the US become the preeminent economic power, it's very hard to make the case that there was this immediate impact from chemicals, when the US was very slow to establish industrial research labs and match Germany on this front. There's a lot of evidence, both empirical, both quantitative and qualitative, that shows the impact of electricity did not come until after 1914, right? It took a long time for factories, for example, to go from like the central shaft and belt system, where there was this one steam engine prime mover that controlled the system of shaft and belts, to then group drive, which is electricity started to power groups of machines. And then finally, we figured out, oh, if we completely change the layout of factories in a more decentralized way, each individual machine could be powered by electricity. That took time, that took organizational, managerial adaptations. Similar story for internal combustion and the automobile industry. Key timings I think the key timings in my story are technology, a GPT that was incubated much earlier, in the 1840s, mid 1800s, through the machine tool industry that created this system of interchangeable parts manufacture, where now if a rifle broke down, you didn't have to buy a whole new rifle. You could just replace the part because you had machine tools that could shape metal and wood in more precise ways, like the milling machine, the turret lathe. And historians showed that in that key period, right, 1880, 1890, before 1914, that's when these technologies were diffusing at torrential proportions. I think when we go to the phase of relative advantage, right, this is the second dimension by which the technological trajectories differ. US firms are first to introduce less than 30% of the innovations in leading sectors. They don't monopolize leading sector innovation, and they're not the leaders in the export of these technologies either. I think this quote from the British Institute of Electrical Engineers is pretty revealing, right? The innovation leadership is contested. UK is not backward when it comes to inventive genius. It's actually about the practical application, right? The diffusion of electricity throughout the country, where the US is ahead. And we see that with this system of interchangeable parts manufacture and machine tools, where the US is now outpacing Britain and Germany in machine intensity by double the rate. It's not about some exclusive access to special innovations of machine tools. Britain sends all these study teams to the US to figure out what's happening here. Why is the US jumping ahead? And all these study and inspection teams emphasize it's about this adaptation across all different branches of industry, the eagerness in which these technologies are diffusing in almost every department of industry. Let me briefly touch on the breadth of growth here. A lot of indicators show that this was a broad-based productivity growth, not concentrated in just the great inventions. And machine tools were a transmission center of this technical knowledge for all these different machine-using industries. Okay, so if it's about this particular technological trajectory, right? If we've narrowed it down to this ability to adopt interchangeable manufacture across all these different industries, which country adapted best? GPT diffusion theory suggests it's about a broad base of engineering skills related to machine tools. And here I find that the US effectively brought in and systematized those skills. Britain just simply didn't produce enough those engineers by all these measures of engineering density. And Germany did produce enough, but their problems were with systematizing and standardizing this body of knowledge. I think one thing that shows that pretty clearly is if you look at these different technological schools, the 3 German schools at the top and the 2 US schools at the bottom, the black line shows the percentage of instruction that's dedicated to practical exercises in the lab and shop. The gray shows oral theoretical instruction that's not connected to the practical applications. And so these are translated from German engineering professors. And this is from US Bureau of Education reports that show the US curriculum is much more optimized towards a standardized set of knowledge that's linked to industry applications. Let me just give one more example from this time period when it comes to leadership in chemicals. Britain and Germany are the birthplace of all these different chemical innovations, but MIT in the US is the birthplace of chemical engineering. And so I think this really reveals that even though the US is pretty far behind when it comes to cutting edge breakthroughs in chemicals, whether it's Nobel Prizes, the amount of chemical research published, where they're ahead is they're able to introduce this new chemical engineering discipline, right? It's not just about who can get the most exports from chemical dyestuffs. It's who can take this underlying principle of chemicalization, right? These standard sets, standard procedures for titration, crystallization, and apply that to doing stuff in the petroleum industry, to preserving food, to applying chemicalization across all these different sectors. That's about who can be ahead in chemical engineering, not about who can publish the most chemical research in top journals. Okay, let me briefly, they teach you to just cram as much text on slides as possible. So let me briefly show you how I've learned those skills. I'm not going to go over all these cases, but I just want to show you that we're following the same process through these other cases, tracing the impact timeframe of the technologies, the phase of relative advantage, the breadth of growth, and then eventually what that means for the skill infrastructure. Same thing from the third industrial revolution, but here the key difference is Japan there's not an economic power transition. Everybody thinks Japan will become the #1 power, but they don't. And here it's a different question. Why? The leading sector mechanism is present. Japan's ahead in all these key industries, right? This is my favorite quote from the entire book, directly tying the Japan case to what was happening, what we just covered with Germany and the domination of dyestuffs. People, when they were talking about Japan, were like, this is Germany all over again. In fact, what they were doing was repeating the mistakes of the leading sector mechanism all over again. And Japan did not overtake the US because they didn't lead in GPT diffusion. Okay, let's get to the part of the talk that was publicized and maybe a lot of you are interested in, which is what does all of this stuff mean for US-China competition in AI and what some people call the fourth industrial revolution. I think there's a fair amount of agreement that AI is this era's most important GPT, but I do just want to say that, like, if I were giving this talk 15 years ago, maybe we would be talking about nanotechnology, and there's a world where nanotechnology is just as, and if not more important than AI. So a lot of technological forecasting is just speculation, and I'm not a super forecaster, but I think there's good evidence that for example, patents that cite AI come from a greater diversity of technology classes than patents that cite blockchain, for example, or biotech. And that's one way to show that there's something more general, more fundamental happening in AI. And people have done the same thing with job posting data. So if we take AI as this era's most important GPT, let's just go through all those dimensions I've outlined, right? There's diverging predictions for the leading sector model and the GPT diffusion model when it comes to impact timeframe, diverging predictions when it comes to the phase that matters the most, diverging predictions when it comes to the breadth of growth, and diverging predictions about the optimal policy adaptations, the optimal institutional adaptations. So let's start with impact timeframe. For me, I'm always like, let's not subtweet. Let's just say who we disagree with very explicitly. So these are the people I disagree with. National Security Commission on AI's final reports clearly outlines this is a pressing matter. China is poised to overtake the US on AI leadership within a decade. Graham Allison at Belfer Center, Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Alphabet, Kai-Fu Lee's book, AI Superpowers, which I believe he presented here a while back, all frame AI will have this immediate impact in the 2020s, right? Within these next 5 years, within the next decade. For me, try this maybe. Well, I think whenever you talk about technology, there has to be a bit of a technical difficulty.
Phone didn't like what you were saying, so it told your computer to shut. There we go.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you, Eliana. So for me, if we're taking the lessons from past GPTs, right, electricity takes 4 decades to diffuse throughout the US economy as the first adopter. Similar timelines for computers, for other GPTs like the steam engine. So we have the new deep learning paradigm incubated in the early 2010s. If those past revolutions serve as a guide, we shouldn't see the productivity payoffs materialize before 2030. Oh, wow, I could just scroll down and we'll be able to see the bottom half of the slides for all this time. Man. So for me, like, that sets up a different timeline, sets up so many different things, right? So much of US policy right now when it comes to like competition with China is on this like 5-year timeline, I think. There's a completely different set of policy prescriptions if your timeline is post 2030 is when the main impacts of AI will come to fruition. Phase of advantage, how do we assess China's strength in AI research and development? Almost all the indicators are focused on innovation capacity. Who has the top frontier firms? Who has the top startups? Who has the top universities? If you look at the diffusion model, GPT diffusion model, and look at, okay, once China develops that frontier innovation, once they're a fast follower in getting access to a frontier innovation, does that then penetrate and diffuse throughout the entire economy? Does that go from the Huawei's of the world to a no-name firm, small-sized, medium-sized firm in an inland province? Because that's what matters for GPT diffusion and productivity growth. And on all these different indicators, China is actually pretty far behind when it comes to the diffusion of information and communications technologies throughout the entire country. So I wrote a paper on this called China's Diffusion Deficit, where I sorted all these different science and technology indicators into the innovation capacity bucket and took the same set and found those that were more attuned and optimized for diffusion capacity, right? So maybe I'll just point out a few of these. So the first 3 on the innovation capacity side, gross expenditures on R&D, how much is your government spending on R&D? Global R&D companies, how much is the average R&D spend of your top 3 companies? QS university rankings, what's the research reputation of your top 3 universities? Diffusion capacity side, ICT access, ICT use. These are composite indexes that measure usage rates of information communications technologies, readiness to adopt these technologies throughout the entire economy. I'll also point out university industry research collaboration. That's an indicator of the strength of the linkages between your universities and your firms, right? So that's important for diffusion because you want the people developing and implementing new technologies to talk with each other. So the brief takeaway is, on the innovation capacity side, China's average global ranking is among the top leaders in the world, right? Number 13, that's like Israel, which a lot of people see as a science and technology superpower. If you average it on the diffusion capacity side, it's more like 47th in the world, a very middling ranking. The closest comparison is the Russian Federation, which US doesn't even put export controls on NVIDIA chips to Russia because we don't care about, they don't have an AI industry, right? No one sees them as a science and tech technology superpower. Breadth of growth. If it's about just picking winners in one industry, like the AI industry, then you should maybe do what the US and China are doing, which is focus on a few industries, targeted industrial policy. Whereas even this quote that supports the GPT diffusion model, that's actually a quote from a research center affiliated with China State Council, their cabinet level body, that specifically criticizes the government's role in targeting specific new technologies, and we need a more economy-wide innovation efforts is what they're recommending. For me, the book in the last chapter outlines why I think the US is very well positioned to have an advantage in GPT skill infrastructure for AI. So one of the indicators I use, I go through some bibliometric data to look at how many universities in each country can train a baseline, can meet a baseline level of quality. So at least one researcher, just one, has published in an established AI conference. China has 29 of those universities. The US has 159. So once you get past the Tsinghuas, the Beidas, the Nanjings of the world, I think the US has a much wider bench of institutions that can train average AI engineers to adopt AI at scale. I mentioned industry academic linkages. If you look at the number of publications that have at least one author from industry and one author from academia, Stanford is like the crystallization of this, right? The US's leadership in hybridity. China lags behind the US by, I think, like half the US's rate. China faces a lot of challenges in this space. So I put all this together in a recent foreign affairs op-ed that talks about how the US can reorient its approach from one being obsessed with dominating innovation cycles in leading sectors toward one that is targeted at improving and sustaining the rate at which AI becomes embedded in a wide range of productive processes. And so there's a few of the specific planks there. I won't get into the details. Happy to talk more there. But that's sort of how I'm translating some of the insights of the book into things that policymakers are debating right now. So let me leave it there. I think the book is trying to, at its core, come up with a better understanding of how and when technologies affect economic power transitions. I think that should force us to reassess our assumptions about how AI could affect the US-China power balance. I think more broadly, though, I'm hoping that this is a way to think about the causal impact of technologies on international politics. It's not that technology determines everything or that all technologies are created equal, but there's some middle ground where we can come up with regular patterns by which some technological features, like general purposeness, has a regular pattern, and then how do societies adopt to that pattern? And there's a middle ground for thinking about the causal effects of technological change. Great. Thank you for your time, and really looking forward to the discussion to follow.
Fantastic. We're going to jump into the Q&A in a second, and we're going to start with our fellows. So be mindful of that. But the most important announcement is that if you registered, and I underline and italicized registered for the seminar, it means you get a lunch, and the lunch arrived a little late, so you feel free to grab your lunch that's here. So you can do that now if you'd like.
That's why I saw all these puzzled faces. It wasn't that I wasn't making any sense.
Oh, it's like, where's our food? Okay. And when I call on you, please do let Jeff know who you are, and please make your questions as crisp as possible. All right, who's up first? Right here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the talk. My name is Max John, pre-doctoral fellow at CSAC. So my question is, one takeaway I have from your talk is actually it seems that technology, ex-ante, and innovation doesn't actually matter at all. And one alternative interpretation of the historical cases you have studied is we have these greater structural factor like per capita capital investment in the economy. So can we sort of make this more general prediction based on your finding that higher income economies ex ante would be predestined to dominate in the diffusion process simply because they have better universities and richer firms that have the resource to implement these new technology into their productivity process?
Yeah, so is it Ed? Is your name? X. Great question.
Elon Musk named him. He was Ed, but then he was rebranded.
There would be all these like longer extensions. So it's a great question. I think when it comes, like, for example, in the statistical chapter of the book where I look at what are the factors that affect variation in computerization rates across different countries, per capita GDP is a control variable, right? It's correlated. Greater development is correlated with greater ability to adopt new technologies. I think here, what I'm doing with the historical case studies is a focused comparison between two different mechanisms. So I'm not trying to explain why do some countries adopt GPTs better than others. I'm trying to explain, if you think technological revolutions are connected with economic power transitions, how does that actually transpire? Does it transpire through this mechanism or through this other mechanism? So yeah, I totally agree that there's a bunch of different factors that are highly correlated and linked to higher rates of adoption of GPTs. But the book is trying to do a fairly narrow exercise on that front.
Next. Can you hand the...
Yeah, Max.
Hey, thank you so much for the great talk. I'm Max, I'm a postdoc here. I have two kind of related questions. One, because you mentioned around 2030 we should see some benefits from the technology, and I was wondering at which point can we make a guess that it might just have been all hype, it might not work out? And relatedly, have there some historic precedents where, for example, some other potential GPT emerged, right, and didn't pay off as much as expected, and how that turned out? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think what one example to use that connects both of your questions is nanotechnology. So if you go back to President Clinton's administration, there's all this investment in a nanotechnology initiative. I think the Deputy Secretary of Commerce says, like, this technology will help the lame walk and cure the blind, and there's all this hype. And now scholars have gone back and said there's almost like this nano fatigue where people don't even really write or talk about nanotechnology anymore. So I'm not sure if there's a way to measure when, like, this was all hype. I think there's probably, you could, like, the Bureau of Census has a module on information technologies where they survey companies and say, like, have you actually tested and trialed AI in your systems? And so the last time they did it was 2019, I think, pre-ChatGPT, but only 3% responded in the affirmative to that question. So you could track that for like 20 years down the line and see if, like, there's been any meaningful uptick in usage to figure out if it was all a hype cycle. I'm very open to the fact that that AI is completely overhyped, but I'm also open to the fact that, like, nanotechnology in the next decade could become that GPT, that because it's such a long time frame, people almost like forget about these other technologies. I thought one of the really interesting things in some of the empirical data on identifying GPTs that Sergio Petraglia has found is that he tries to rank different technology domains on GPT-ness. And image classification in his data is, like, ranked up there in, like, 6th, right? So that's very connected to deep learning as a paradigm. But a lot of the top ones were still in electricity and electronics. So I think there's a lot of I think the GPT mindset is to say there's a lot that old technologies can teach us because they incubate for a long time and they have these protracted diffusion trajectories.
Okay, thanks. Other fellows? Yep, please.
Thank you for the talk. My name is Ambarish. I'm a visiting scholar here. You mentioned that if you followed the GPT model and not the LS model, you'd have a different set of recommendations for what the US is doing today. So if you could just elaborate on some of the things that you think are not going the right way and what would you recommend otherwise?
Yeah, so let me start with a simple illustration, which is the Chips and Science Act, right? Probably the most ambitious industrial policy since post-war era in the US. And the planks that are very much in the leading sector model are all the planks associated with we need to bring chip manufacturing back home to the US and support, we need to increase our production in this key sector. I think the planks that are most attuned to the GPT diffusion model are all the stuff about the STEM workforce development planks, to sort of broaden the base of just general engineering talent that could be really useful for adopting AI at scale. Now, guess which one has been allocated the funds more quickly and implemented more effectively from the Chips and Science Act? Very much the leading sector account, you know? Intel can, when you have concentrated interests pushing for a particular policy, you can get what you want. So one of the recommendations in the foreign affairs piece is you've already authorized all this funding for STEM workforce development. Use the same amount of political capital, time, and attention to allocate those funds and implement. So that's a small example because that's a piece of legislation that's already been passed, and it's just it's in the implementation details. But for me, more broadly, I think the US's export controls on AI are very much in this Fortress America, we need to prevent technological leakage type of approach. And it's very hard to prevent another advanced economy from accessing a general purpose technology. And I think we will look back in 20 years and be like, the export controls were probably either didn't work or were counterproductive. And the stuff that matters a lot more is sort of the running faster approaches. How can the US invest in our own institutions to be better equipped to adapt to to diffusing AI at scale?
All right, most important question, what do you want for your lunch so that we can reserve it? Okay, and while we do that, are there any other fellows who want to? Yep.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Bogdan. I'm a pre-doctoral fellow here at CSAC. It's a pleasure to have the chance to interact with you. I was just wondering if you factor at any point the importance of alliances in the role of GPTs in the importance of alliances, because I'm thinking directly at the Defense Innovation Accelerator at the level of NATO, the DIANA that was that was created a couple of years ago, and if you think that it might have, for example, an effect on the model proposed by you. Thank you very much.
Great. Yeah, so I do think alliances play a role in terms of diffusing technology across borders. If like countries in NATO might be more prepared to adapt to a cutting edge innovation because they have strong linkages, right, with all these other countries in NATO. For me, though, the process that matters much more is once that innovation has been diffused to like your frontier firm or frontier university, then how does it get spread across the entire economy internally? So one of the most interesting stats that I found is I think this was a study of OECD countries by Andrews et al., where they looked at the gap between the initial adoption gap has shrunk. So for a NATO country, for a country in a NATO, that has access to this defense innovation DIANA thing, the time that one of their frontier firms will get access to a new innovation, maybe incubated in the US, that gap is shrinking by the day. I'm not as concerned about that gap. What this Andrews et al. Study found is the gap in all these OECD countries from the time from a frontier firm deploying that technology to sort of a broad amount of small and medium-sized firms adopting that technology, that gap has actually increased. So I don't know if alliances play that much of a role when it comes to that second gap, which is the one that I'm more concerned about.
All right, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask a question, and I'm going to go to Herb and Jim. So, Jeff, the book is fantastic. I think you do a really good job of kind of poking holes at two fixations in technology, especially around AI. You know, the focus on innovation versus diffusion, and also just this assumption that there's just profound first mover advantage as opposed to like fast follower advantage. But I want to ask a question that brings the national security state back in. So your story is largely one about society or economy-wide diffusion. Yep. And therefore, it's not about first mover advantage. It's about who can win the medium or long game. And there you actually make a very compelling case that the United States is well positioned. I would argue we're well positioned both to innovate and win the long game according to your model. But the national security state, it doesn't worry about the long game. They worry that there's some decisive breakthrough, and it's not horizontal diffusion they worry about, it's vertical integration. That is, the U.S. national security state believes a U.S. company will be the first to develop a frontier model that we might describe as artificial general intelligence. But they also believe China would be the first to actually integrate it for national security applications. So think like systemic cyber attack, highly tailored pathogens, things that would be game changers from a military capability perspective. So I guess the question is, are there still first mover advantages that would have profound implications on great power competition based on which state could integrate it more quickly? And could the CCP or the PLA brute force their way into integrating these technologies in ways that were decisive long before the compute-starved U.S. national security state could?
Yeah, so a few things. Let me start by saying I think the GPT diffusion model has a lot of traction when it comes to military power as the outcome versus just economic productivity. So I had another paper that looked at the history of how electricity shaped military affairs. And in the late 19th century, a lot of people were thinking about electricity in that model you just described when it came to AGI. There would be some sort of decisive strategic breakthrough. Specifically, all the journals at that time were talking about electric rays of mass destruction that would wipe out entire battlefields. And I think that's what we gravitate towards, right? There's going to be some sort of, AGI as a nuclear bomb sort of thing. I think for me, when it comes to general purpose technologies like electricity, the historical evidence showed no, that we didn't get electric rays of mass destruction. What we got were gradual, protracted diffusion of electrical innovations across all these different military applications, from coastal defenses to communications, transportation, logistics. And it was actually the back end stuff that mattered more when it came to military power. So let me start there with, I think GPT diffusion can still apply to military power. I think there's let me push back on 2 points when it comes to, first of all, this idea that AGI will be this decisive breakthrough. When I ask people, okay, and I've asked people pretty plugged in the national security state, this question is like, what does AGI look like in terms, is it just one day DeepMind opens up a box and we get AGI? And I think the best response I've seen, and you gave some of the really good examples, but I think one of the best responses they gave was like, think 100 million programmers, right? 100 million really strong programmers, better than the best programmers we have now. And then when I think about that, wait, that sounds a lot more like what electricity did in terms of boosting productivity. That sounds a lot more like a computer, right? So I think you get really into the realm of speculation when you make that type of policy. And it's sort of interesting that we can adopt such a precautionary principle when it comes to AGI, but not when it comes to any other element of our security policy. And I would also disagree that like China would just be able to marshal compute resources faster than the US. I think like there's this assumption that the Chinese state can execute a Manhattan Project whenever it wants to, but I'm not sure that's true. Like even when it comes to like China's current startups in large language models, they would all prefer funding from like dollar-denominated VC funds rather than government guidance funds, because there's a belief that like the state does not have their best interests in heart, is going to steal their technology, and attaches all these strings to like government guidance funding. So I think there's a lot of different holes in that argument, and it's not secured on any sort of like, it's not really secured on empirical evidence. But it's hard to argue against them, because they'll also say, oh, we have access to like classified information that you don't have. So like to support the export controls, you'll see like in the rationales to support the export controls, people will bring up like, oh, NVIDIA GPUs were used to like do simulations that lead to hypersonic missiles or something like that. But I think like CSEC's or FSI's Cameron Tracy has pointed out, look, this idea that hypersonic missiles are some sort of decisive strategic advantage, that's a little flawed too. So I just think like this stuff that you just mentioned is actually never spelled out in US policy. Nobody ever mentions the term AGI when they defend the US's approach to technological competition. And that epistemologically, epistemically, I think that's also a big issue because then you can't have open debate about the assumptions behind the policy.
Agree with all that, but you can't, it's just suddenly hold the US government accountable for empirical evidence. That seems, Herb.
So this was a great talk. I think you made a very strong case that the GPT model for diffusion is very important and explains a lot, drives power and so on. But I sort of don't see why you set up GPT and leading sector in opposition to each other. This is part of what Colin was hinting at that. But it came to me when you showed Eric Schmidt and Graham Allison's quote about it. I mean, Eric Schmidt certainly would not say that the future of AI is on a downward trajectory, even in the long term. He would certainly say that AI is going to revolutionize everything in the world and give you everything that's better than sliced bread. Okay, I mean, he would surely say that. So I don't quite understand the tension that you set up between the two, and you of course exploit the tension when you say you have to prioritize. I think you have to do both, and so what I'm trying to reconcile that tension.
Yeah, so I think you can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? I think there's a lot of overlap between GPT diffusion and leading sector product cycles. But I think as sort of that table showed in the theory slide, they do make like directly opposing predictions about how technological revolutions will shape economic power transitions. And so I think there's a world where investing in all the leading sector stuff, you almost stumble into, okay, focusing solely on cutting edge R&D has these spillover effects that then allow you to develop GPT skill infrastructure, and you stumble into that, into meeting the demands of that. I think here, the contrast is when the technology will make its mark, right? So that's just a truth value claim. When do you think AI will enable China to leapfrog the US as an economic power? Is it within the next decade, or is it after 2030? And that has significant policy implications. Let me just run through the scenario for export controls, right? If you think we're operating on a 5-year timeline for export controls where we need to prevent China from overtaking the US in this technology, and then once and sort of the key stakes are sort of the impact of technology early on in its development cycle in the next 5 years, then maybe the export controls are a justifiable, are a smart policy. If you're operating on this is a marathon, not a sprint, it's going to be happening after 2030, there's no way you're going to prevent like Huawei Ascend processors from getting good enough to the NVIDIA technologies after 10, 20 years. And there's no way to predict where like compute trajectories are going to go. So that's a very specific example. But I think you could run that same analysis for all these different policies.
But why isn't slowing them down a good idea no matter when you are at the site?
Well, I think the point is slowing them down also comes with a bunch of different consequences, right? So slowing them down reduces NVIDIA's ability to compete with Huawei in the long term. Slowing them down has no downsides if you're only looking at it from a 5-year timeline. It's going to have huge ramifications if you're looking at it on a 20 to 30-year timeline. I think also, like, if the juice is just not worth the squeeze, export controls just come with a lot of other side effects, right? It prevents the ability to cooperate on managing AI safety risks. The export controls also veer pretty close to an economic containment strategy, which we know from history has a lot of side effects, and probably Cold War scholars can speak to that more to me. But I'm just saying, if the juice isn't worth the squeeze and there's a different approach to securing U.S. technological leadership, why even expose ourselves to all that risk?
Jim Fearon.
Really interesting. Two questions that are kind of in the vein of clarifications, and I probably missed it in the talk. So first one, I can, it seems clear how ex post you can look at historical examples and say, oh yeah, that was a general purpose technology, and it falls in that category because you know what happened. Can we identify ex ante when, here's a new innovation? Can we say like, oh yeah, that's a general purpose one? I mean, AI seems plausible, although maybe we'll find out it actually has somewhat rather narrow, really beneficial or useful applications. I don't know. So there's this kind of ex ante, do you have a list of criteria that enables us to spot them ex ante? And then the second thing, also related to like the concept, I guess, is it that, when you say the term general purpose technology focuses on the technology, but it seems like from your argument, it's not just the technology, it's like all kinds of facts about society and government maybe. So is it kind of misleading actually to focus, is what your argument is really actually about something much more complicated, which would be an interaction between the tech and all this other stuff? And if that's the case, you could have maybe the same tech in two different countries, and one, it's going to be diffusing and general purpose, and the other, it doesn't.
Yeah, great set of questions. So let's start with, how do you identify a GPT ex ante? So the three characteristics of a GPT that I'm using are scope for continual improvement, pervasiveness, so application across all these different sectors of the economy, and technological complementarity. So it requires complementary innovations in the application sectors for it to actually make its mark. For the historical stuff, we don't quite have the data, especially for the first industrial revolution, to go back through and really operationalize these, but people have done it for the other cases. So Sergio Petraglia's work has looked at the second industrial revolution to sort of quantify the GPT-ness of electricity. And people have done that in the starting stages for AI. So that might be an exercise to look at. One of the things that they look at, for example, to measure the pervasiveness is look at all the patents that cite AI technology and measure like the diversity of the technology classes for all the patent citations. And so that can tell you that, okay, this seems to be more pervasive than blockchain technology or biotechnology. And then for the technological complementarity point, I think what they do is measure the technology classes that most cite AI. Then do we see like more innovative activity in that technology class? So I can point you to the articles that get into the nitty gritty of that, but people are doing that, and people are trying to do that with job posting data to sort of empirically identify GPTs as well. This is a lot of work done by economists. I think Daniel Rock at Wharton School and Eric Brynjolfsson here at Stanford have done some projects on that. Second, but I take your point in that this is a challenge, especially for the historical cases. Second is this about facts about society, or is it facts about technology? I think I want to stand firm on this idea that there is something different about an electric dynamo versus a spinning jenny.
What?
A spinning jenny, something that helped us spin cotton more efficiently. And so, and I think there's some technological difference there where one technology has an internal logic that is more enabling than this. Like the dynamo has something about it, right? Something not magical, but something random, some combination of elements that allows it to be more enabling than a spinning jenny invention. And so, yes, I do think society plays a role, But let me give you an example. Alan Defoe had this paper where he looked at how electricity grids developed in the US and Britain. And Britain's society was much more about, it's going to be all localized. We want electricity and technology to reflect our local politics. But he has this great quote where he said, Britain chose to adopt national and kind of scaled electric grids in the same way that like I choose to give my wallet to you if you hold a gun at me and rob me at gunpoint, right? And so I think society plays a role, but I do want to leave some room for like not all technologies are created equal. And there is something more enabling about some technology advances than others.
Well, we are at time. I do think that there is, there's a lot of this conversation was about AI, and I think that there is sometimes a view that the present is so different from the past. The past is not particularly relevant to policy in the present, and I think Jeff's talk shows that that is most certainly not the case. I encourage you all to get the book. It's awesome, and we're really excited that we were able to welcome Jeff back to talk about all the great research, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. So thanks. Thanks for all of you.